Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Changes in Claims series, part 10. Can't believe this is the 10th class. It's been a while since we've done the first one. I'm going to pull up the first part of today's presentation. So it's going to be on the changes in claims, training, pricing, productivity, impacts in construction. So 1 second. All right, so computer is a little slow. I'm going to turn off my camera for these purposes. Anyway, so, okay, good morning. We've done 9 trainings so far. So we've gone over notifications. We've gone over differing site conditions. We've gone over documentation for best practices for documentation for ACC. We've gone over potential claim tracking within ACC issues. We've gone a little bit over correspondence tracking and tracking notifications that way. We've gone over tracking acceleration, mitigation, and many other things in terms of changes in claims. But today, we've also gone over schedules. So both Kai, Joel, and Kathleen may be joining, but they all are here as well. So if you have any questions in terms of anything that we've talked about through this entire series thus far, please feel free to ask your questions. Please put it in the chat. Joel will be monitoring that chat. So if you do have any questions throughout this entire presentation, please feel free to put that in the chat. Additionally, we do have the recordings of all of the previous trainings, and this one will also be on the h.wiki site. So please feel free to check that out on the h.wiki site in the archives page for the Econ Office Hours archives page. So with that, let's get started with pricing and productivity impacts in construction. So just to start off, the objective today to explain the methods of pricing changed work, quantifying productivity impacts, and show how the specifications, procedures control entitlement, evidence, and teach practical steps for preparing, reviewing, defending change order claims. And also part 2 of today is going to be showing the best practices for documenting cost justifications. So distinguishing between time justification, cost justification. I know there have been some past examples where that may have been confused, so we're going to go over that today. So the first part is going to be showing some methods, and then the second part is we're going to go over training that was already done by Kai and Kathleen, the CA200 series. So I took some of the content from that training, and we're going to highlight some of those slides because bringing back to today, those things are still important and won't go into too major detail. Obviously, we do have that training available on the wiki site. We have the entire CA100, 200, all of those series on the wiki site, but I did pull some and we're going to highlight some of those slides here today. So with that, let's get started. Understanding some of the construction cost methods. So a couple of different things, right? We obviously have forward pricing, and this is obviously preferred because we're being proactive and we are forward pricing these changes. And then the second thing is post pricing, right? And that's obviously price established after work is already performed. A lot of cases, that happens in emergency work or when immediate performance is absolutely necessary. But what happens is there are challenges that come along with that, right? Heavy dependence on timely records. The contractor will submit their force account reports, right? And obviously we talked about acceleration mitigation. A lot of times if the work is already completed and the contractor incurs the cost, if it's post pricing, then there isn't many things that HDOT can do to mitigate some of the costs that would potentially be mitigated if it was done in forward pricing, right? If the pricing was done beforehand and we proactively negotiated the prices and went back and forth on that. So those are some of the challenges, and obviously some of the keys in controlling that is when force account post pricing is used. Obviously, we do require daily records, so that'll be through the daily force account report that your inspector does, and then also has the contractor's project engineer or team sign that to enforce the daily documentation of that. And then also, obviously, we have our own diaries that we're keeping track of and making sure that we record that accordingly in Headlight through the diaries so that we can compare notes, and then we can make sure that those costs are justified and would hold up under any audit. And then backtracking to forward pricing, which is obviously the preferred method. So definition for that: price and time frame negotiated, agreed before the change work begins. And when to use this: discrete scope changes with definable quantities, or if the impacts that are foreseeable or where schedule impact can be calculated immediately. We'll talk a little bit about schedule impact. I know we went over the critical path method with Joel probably a couple months ago. So some of the advantages that I've already discussed is preserve schedule clarity, easy to incorporate into critical path, reduces cumulative impact risks, and obviously there is a simpler audit trail when the negotiations and things are negotiated for pricing. So, okay. So there are many methods, and none necessarily are perfect. But what we're going to do here today is provide you with various different methods, and some that you can potentially use when you're formulating your independent cost estimates. When you're analyzing a claim, will perhaps give you some insight into what the contractors are thinking and how the contractors are calculating productivity, how the contractors are calculating their cost estimates. Obviously, we have the cost proposal submittals that the contractors will be submitting, or they'll be submitting some cost justifications in claims. So we want to be sure that we can understand where they're coming from, but also be able to provide an independent cost estimate separate from the contractor's cost proposal. And one of the most important things is that it's separate, so that we have our own price that we've calculated totally separate from the contract, not impacted from what the contractor is already going to be submitting for. So we want to be able to have two separate ones so that we could go and compare. And obviously that is a P&L, which we'll be talking about and mentioning later, as that's something that Kai and Kathleen both explained thoroughly in the CA200 series. So we'll talk about this actual cost and segregated cost method. So in essence, what it is the contractor segregates changed work costs into separate cost codes and substantiates each entry with invoices, timesheets, equipment logs, and all of that. So if they were to do this on their cost proposal, we'd want to require any extra work items for change orders, anything that has to do with any differing site conditions, daily force account forms for any labor and equipment charged, and obviously final thing is signed inspector verification daily for force account entries. And I obviously enforce this all the time. We've talked about this a lot, but that signed inspection verification daily force account report is very, 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 very important, and especially with the requirement that the contractor is supposed to sign that, because that will be the agreement on that day. And a lot of times when we're dealing with these, or we're analyzing these claims, when we're taking a look at the change justifications, that is a month, 2 months later. Not ideally, but a lot of times that happens. So if we have that signed documentation of the contractor saying this is the work with this amount of people and this time, then that will help in our negotiations, having that documentation there. So just wanted to reiterate that again. So obviously we want to verify those daily force account forms by the inspector and check it against the certified payroll, right? Want to make sure that the rates and the labor rates that they're submitting and time checks against the certified payroll. want to match equipment hours to rental agreements or company equipment logs. So we want to make sure that, we're checking the equipment hours, checking the equipment rate, right? And making sure that they're submitting those equipment rates that we can review and make sure that we're certified. Make sure that they're certified, sorry. And then finally, verified material invoices are dated and attributed to the change work. So submitting those material invoices that are attached to these costs. And then also another method, total cost versus modified total cost. So what is the total cost? The contractor seeks full project overrun as the owner responsibility. So this change will be all on the owner's responsibility. So oftentimes what happens is it's rarely accepted on its face value because it's essentially saying that in this case, HDOT would own the entire cost changes or would own the entire change. So in order to do this, the contractor, we got to make sure that the contractor provides bid was reasonable, losses otherwise are incalculable, costs are reasonable in their cost proposal and verified, and making sure that the reasoning behind it is that the contractor is not at fault. It was all on the owner's fault. And then also modified total costs. So then this is another scenario where the contractor claims increased total costs, but then subtracts items for which the contractors are then responsible for. So for example, inefficiencies, extras that are not owner caused. So this would be kind of in the middle where the contractor will incur some of the cost, but not all of it. And so some tips to evaluate those is require the contractor to show a reasonable bid basis and also identify those excluded items that the contractor will incur the cost for. I know we mentioned this briefly, measured mild analysis, and this is something that is used widely across contractors and also in other estimating tools, but it compares a clearly unimpacted production rate versus impacted production rate on the same contract to isolate the contractor's loss. So this is a lot of times what the contractor will use for their productivity rates, and they'll show their unimpacted production rate versus their impacted production rates, and then that's how they'll quantify some of the losses or gains that they have. So prerequisite for an admissible measured mile analysis, reliable daily production logs. So on a daily basis, right, you have the baseline production, the baseline production logs, what normally the production is, and then that'll include stable crews, resources, and methods during that baseline period. Also comparable work units. So making sure that we're comparing apples to apples and we're not comparing apples to oranges. So we have the same equipment, same crew composition, all of that. So it's in essence, we're making sure that, we have a baseline for productivity, and then when impacted work happens, then we have the productivity for the impacted work, right? And the ability to show the changes between the two and the cost changes and perhaps the time changes, that is an analysis that is often done by the contractors and perhaps, should be done on HDOT's end as well. So yeah, so a little bit more definitions and recognition. So cumulative impact. So that is, multiple events, multiple small changes, multiple differing site conditions, owner directive that individually might be minor together, but together will reduce productivity materially, right? So these small changes may lead to, a bigger change and an actual change. And these are often missed. Each event recorded in isolation, right? So some of these small changes may seem minor at one point during the project, but it may add up to something bigger. So it may add to a bigger delta, which will still affect the project. So some sources of inefficiency, and this is some of the things that we can look for on our projects, right? First is disruption, so frequent stopping of work, stopping. It may seem small at one point if this happens a couple times, but then if it happens more more often, then that can lead to some bigger changes. So, we got to make sure that we are tracking that, and obviously through the diary, through our diaries, we're making sure that we're tracking how much work the contractor is doing on a daily basis, and if they're stopping, if they're ending early these days, some days, then we got to make sure that we're tracking all of that, because some small minor start and stop of work may lead to something bigger. So this is an indicator of something down the line of maybe steam of short daily production, with large gaps in between. So we also talked about acceleration before. So we want to notice if the contractor is accelerating work. So more overtime, increased crew count, but reduced per hour productivity. And some indicators for that are, overtime hours, production per hour. We want to make sure that we are careful with our directives, right? Because as we've talked about in our previous training, if it is a owner directive acceleration, then the contractor may be entitled to those cost changes, right? So if they're going to charge overtime, production per hour changes and grows, then we got to make sure that if it's an owner directed one, that we control those costs and we make sure that we are monitoring that as needed. Next, so something that's called overcrowding or trade stacking, which is conflicting trade sequences and increasing rework. So some of the indicators for this is inspectors, notes of congestion in work, double handling recorded. So we want to make sure that we're tracking that as well. Next, we see this a lot, out of sequence work. So on a lot of projects, if there is a directive from the owner, or if the contractor just simply will change the sequence of work for their efficiency or for reasoning that they have, right? Then we want to make sure that we're tracking that, because this can be an impact and this can lead to a loss of productivity. So we want to make sure that if the contractor is doing things out of the original sequence of work that they showed from their baseline schedule, that we document that, because it may be the contractor's fault, right? So that may be a contractor decision, right, that they made on their own, not an HDOT directive, that leads to a loss of productivity in which HDOT would not be entitled to charge the cost for. So we want to make sure that we are tracking that. Sometimes, there is an HDOT directive or a change that will change the sequence of work, and that may lead to loss of productivity, right? So then the contractor may be actually entitled to that cost or time, right? But we have to be able to prove that. So tracking this is of the utmost importance. And again, like I said, we see this often quite often on some of the jobs that we're dealing with, or at least I have seen some of this as well. And then finally, some mitigation strategies. So we talked about acceleration already, and we'll talk about mitigation again briefly. Require early notification and documentation. This is, we can't enforce this enough. Require early notification and documentation, making sure we're tracking notification, making sure that we're tracking it in ACC so that everybody can see it, so that when other people jump on the project, or when even more so when your resident engineer or your construction engineer or district engineer needs to see something on your project and see all of them when the notifications occurred, see all the proper documentation, that they have that access, right? So we want to make sure that we're documenting that, and we'll talk a little bit about documentation in a little bit and how we're presenting it to the resident engineer, construction engineer, and district engineer a little bit later. So, and then finally, periodic productivity reporting. So obviously being able to track productivity of the contractor, that is important in being able to quantify and also track some of these loss of productivity and some inefficiencies on the project by the contractor. So that is important. Okay, so sometimes in claims we'll see these are some of the things that we'll often see, right? These are some just typical. These are not everything that can happen, but oftentimes these are the things and these are the elements that we'll see in some of these material and equipment claims. So first is material escalation, right? And what we would need from the contractor in order to justify a material escalation is evidence of schedule delay tied to the escalation, plus all of the invoices, market index, if available. So, right, asphalt, steel index. So all of those material costs showing how it cost this much in 2020 and this much in 2025 and how it was different, and then making sure that that time change and showing the schedule impact. All of this is tied together and needed when the contractor is submitting for a claim for material escalation. So we want to make sure that we have all of that. And if the contractor is not submitting that in their claim for material escalation, we want to make sure that we require that of them, and we can ask for these. We should ask for these things, right? We need to ask for these things when it comes to material escalation claims. Secondly, equipment costs, right? So we want to acquire equipment logs. Obviously, equipment logs should be submitted at the beginning of the project. We can have that baseline, and then if they are able to prove, it costs more later on, then that is something that they have to prove. Rental agreements, hours, equipment rates should match contract or be justified. So we want to make sure that we're tracking also equipment costs. So there's material escalations, equipment costs, and then finally, spec tie-ins. So we want to make sure that we exercise, the specs that we have. So the methods of price agreements will allow engineers to determine reasonable and necessary costs, and require use of the allowances for overhead and profit, calculating change order markups. So want to be sure that we're tying everything into the spec, especially when we're doing, our cost estimates and force accounts in particular as well. So if we're doing post pricing, the force accounts, we want to make sure that everything is according to those force account regulations and guidelines in the specifications. Okay, a little bit more on some elements, and I know this has been discussed about recently, but a lot of times when we're analyzing claims, these are the stuff that are harder to quantify. And so field on-site overhead, so overhead and home office overhead. So obviously field overhead, so short-term supervision, utilities, equipment standby, often in force accounts. So we want to make sure that we were able to track and make sure that we're able to know and recognize the differences between field overhead and home office overhead, because we don't want to, in claims, we don't want to get double charged for these certain things if they're already charging it in other areas. So we want to make sure that we understand the difference between field overhead and home office overhead. So field overhead and then home office overhead typically claim when the contractor's overall workload over an extended period prevented absorption of overhead for the entire office. And one of the common methods is the Eichle formula. There are other accepted methods, but this is the most widely used formula in federal practice. And so we should be familiar with this formula, and we should be able to utilize this to calculate our independent cost estimate, to calculate our estimation of what it should be, because the contractor is going to have their own, and they may or may not show necessarily, what specific formula they use, but we want to be sure that, we're able to utilize the methods at our hands and be able to justify that to the construction engineer, district engineer, to federal highways. So yes.
Hey, Cord.
Yes.
Hey, I just wanted to add something real quick on that
Yes.
that slide, because I think
Yes.
it is an important one, if you don't mind.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so for field office overhead, home office overhead, this is, it's an important topic of this discussion. I've seen this on several of the claims I've looked at recently, and one thing I wanted to just point out too on this is both all of the overhead that's submitted for a delay claim, that the delay is, you know, owned by HDOT, that has to be related. The costs that are submitted for that has to be related to the delay period. And I'm emphasizing it because I've seen it on a couple now where basically the contractor is coming in and saying, you know, this is the team that we have to run this project, and by this delay occurring at this time, our team, that entire team, is now having to stay on the project for an extended period because of the delay. But that's not necessarily how it works. It's got to be tied to the delay period. So in other words, if your project is still moving, but your critical path is delayed, you know, in a lot of cases, the management team for the project is still doing other things on the project. So there has to be sort of a line drawn somewhere where you say, okay, well, you know, maybe they were partly delayed, this crew, but you can't really say that, because by keeping the project moving, you're actually helping mitigate some of this cost that we're talking about right here. So, you know, just take a hard look at that when you see it, because you want to make sure that the specific delay period, that's what you're looking at as far as this overhead, and, you know, the field overhead and the home office overhead and everything. It's not like you're not looking at it for future, like we're going to, you know, because the project is being pushed out 3 months because of this delay, we're having to extend all of our people for 3 months because, you know, they were able to get portions of the work completed. So in other words, it's, yeah, you kind of look at it like that. It's not like a blank check that we're just saying, okay, we're going to pay for all of your management costs for this entire period. If that makes sense. I just wanted to add that because it is something that I've been looking at. I've seen a few claims that basically the contractor is claiming that they, you know, it's like their project superintendent and, you know, project engineers, they're just putting full-time hours for these guys, even though they were able to expedite other portions of the work during the delay, if that makes sense. So there's got to be like an analysis down there. Just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Joel. Does anyone have any questions? We're about at the halfway mark, and I'm going to switch over to the second part of this training. So does anybody have any questions so far? I haven't been looking at the chat, Joel, so I'm not sure if people have been asking.
No, I haven't seen any questions come in yet.
All right. So please feel free, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. I'm going to pull up the second part of the presentation. Okay. All right. So, okay. Now we've talked about, you know, various different methods, taking a look at what the contractor is thinking, taking a look at what we should think when the contractor is formulating some of these cost proposals. Now let's take a look at, you know, how do we present this information to HDOT? So what is the proper way to present these justifications, right? So when we're writing a change, or when we're analyzing a claim that will lead to a change, we want to be sure that we know how to properly document this and how to properly document it so that the resident engineer, people who are perhaps not as involved on the project on a daily basis, can be able to understand what's going on and make a proper and informed decision. So, as I said before, this PowerPoint has been on the wiki site for about 4 years now. So I pulled some of the more pertinent slides to what we're talking about here today. So again, if you would like to see the full, I know there's pretty long trainings. So if you want to see the full version of this, training that Kai and Kathleen did a few years back. Please feel free to go to the wiki site. At the end of this training, I'll link both the e-construction office hours archive placed on the wiki site, and I'll also link this change order series, part 2, CA 202 series, or 200 series, excuse me, sorry. But okay, let's get started. So again, throughout the entire change order series, we're referencing, obviously the HDOT specs, and the pertinent spec that we need to look at throughout all of this is 104, 105, 106, 107, 109, section 100. Want to be sure that we are able to read and understand the legal options that we have and things that we can exercise on the project per specifications. Additionally, the construction procedures are there, and we have them on the wiki site. And so please be sure all of this is on the wiki site. So if you need to reference it, please go ahead there. So this is some of what talked about in the training. We're going to talk about most of this, but justification for time changes. First of all, I know this is a pricing and productivity construction training, or that's what we talked about in the beginning. But here we're going to talk about a little bit about time changes, which is we've already talked about in schedule, the CPM training that Joel already mentioned. And Joel, please feel free to jump in if you have anything to add to this. But we're going to talk a little bit about the time justification, impact to critical path, what we need to show, talk about justification for cost changes specifically. We're going to get into who, what, when, where, why, and how. And then also, obviously, all of this is going to be audited in COCUA reviews coming. One of them is upcoming at the beginning of next year. So let's be sure that we have all the documentation in ACC and also in Headlight ready for that. So let's move on. Let's get started. Okay, so purpose of a change order documentation. Throughout the training, we've mentioned this. I'm not going to go into great detail. It proves that change orders are necessary and proper, demonstrates that the project engineer exercised sound judgment in the performance of his or her duties, demonstrates compliance with laws, regulation, the contract, the specs, and procedures with what I just showed. Clear, concise, complete, and accurate historical record of the change order. It should be clear, concise, complete, and accurate. If somebody were to jump on the project who was not even involved, they should be able to complete a change order and see all the history. This is important. It's factual, not opinion. I know a lot of times that opinions can come into play, but we want to make sure that our justifications are based off of facts. Finally, reviewers and auditors can concur with the project engineer's words and actions. So reviewers, obviously, resident engineers, CEs, DEs, and any auditors, federal highways, COCUA review audits, we want to be sure that we're following the rubric, following baselines, and want to make sure that we're following all of this information. So again, I'm not going to go fully into detail, but justifications will be prepared when there is a time extension due to the contractor, due the contractor for work, agreed unit or lump sum prices for extra work, forced account work increases, or extra work on a forced account basis required by a change. So we need to provide a justification. It's twofold, right? First is, before we get into the two parts of it, CCO reviewers, resident engineer, construction engineer, district engineer, they're looking at the project engineer's decisions leading to settlement. So they're looking at the project engineer's negotiations, why the settlement is fair and reasonable to the circumstances, and assurance that they're following laws, regulation, policies, and procedures throughout the change order. This is all before they sign that change order. So the first part of a justification, if applicable, is the time extension, right? So it will be prepared for all changes that add time to a contract or phase. In cases where the work is not being done during the contract time, a justification is also required for the time to do the work separate from the contract. So just wanted to outline what it says. Specific modifications of contractor time, some of the reasons. So that may occur changes in work, additional work, delays caused by the state, delays for permits, we sometimes see that as well. Delays beyond contractors' control, delays in materials or equipment. We talked about material escalation. We talked about some of the different pricing for that. But this is for potential modifications of contract time, delays for suspension of work, and also perhaps a reduction in time. And just to outline it even more, justification of any extension shall be based on the effect of the critical path. We talked about this previously when we were going over critical path method schedules. Any time extension or any time extension, any change that has an effect to the time needs to be justified based off the critical path, right? So justification based on how long the order work will take without an explanation to the order's effect to the critical path is incomplete and not acceptable. If that is not justified, or if there is not an explanation to the how the critical path got changed and caused the delay or reduction in time, the justification is incomplete and will not be acceptable. I just wanted to make that clear and make sure that on any time justification that we have, our TIA, making sure that we're showing the baseline schedule, impacted schedule, all of that. So this is just a reminder, obviously not going to go into super great detail. We talked already about what the critical path is, some of the requirements within submitting a schedule, how to submit a schedule in ACC, how they're submitting their progress schedules every month, how we're importing that to the schedules module so that we can view it and make our proper reviews for it. And then also finally, what we're talking about now is, time justification support. The contractor must support the time extension request, schedule showing the impact to critical path statements from subs, suppliers, manufacturer as necessary should be included in any cost proposal or claim for that pertains to a time extension. All right, so shifting gears. Justification can have two parts, right? First, obviously, time justification. Second is cost justification, and this is more aligned with what we were talking about in the beginning of this presentation. So justification for extra work will be prepared for all changes that have extra work or cost changes. So the cost justification, what will it do? What should it outline? It should validate pricing with the independent cost estimate, so an ICE, created prior to receiving the contractor's proposal, right? So we should not be, again, I emphasized this earlier, we should be creating this independent of the contractor's cost estimate. So this should be created prior to receiving the contractor's proposal. It should summarize the cost comparison, should explain consequences of any findings, discoveries, disclosures that occurred during negotiations that led to agreement. So PNM, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Prove completeness and reasonableness of the settlement. So eventually going to settle, right, on a cost. So we want to be sure that we are including all of this in the justification that leads to that settlement. So we're validating pricing with an independent estimate. So there are a few different ways, and Kai and Kathleen went in detail over these methods that you could potentially use. So just quickly go over three of them. So schedule of agreed prices for lump sum items, section 10406, talked about that previously, methods of price agreement or unit price adjustments. So that is the first option, and probably the most utilized option that people will utilize on their independent cost estimates. 2 and 3, so recent historical bid tab data in Socrata. So I know state folks, you have access to Socrata, and I know specifically for consultants, if you do need access to Socrata, just talk to your field office team, and I'm sure they'll be able to get you some of the updated bid tab data to help in terms of developing that independent cost estimate, getting some of the updated prices, comparing from what it was historically to comparing to what it is now, and then calculating those changes. So that is an option for developing your independent cost estimate. And then there's external websites that can be utilized. So one of the ones that when they're originally training on was RS means. And I believe that, you know, at the time, at least, you're able to get a free trial and be able to use it for a little while. But the point is that there are external and other ways that you're able to find some of an estimated cost for some of these pay items that are comparable, that will utilize location, that will utilize in various different pricing methods that will give you kind of a guideline as to how to formulate your independent cost estimate. And then also, you know, at the very bottom, there are other things that you can use to compare. So diaries, let's think of manpower and equipment, certified payrolls, blue books. So looking at the equipment rates, submittal material data, quotes, engineering, preliminary detailed estimate. So obviously we all have that at the beginning of the project. So obviously that is an option to take a look at, and all of these things combined can help you create your independent cost estimate. And as I was talking about previously, RS means this is one of the external websites that you could potentially use to develop your cost estimate. So obviously, in this case, it would be setting up a new estimate in that website, then including a location so that it'll adjust the cost, search for line items, add the estimates, and then add quantities, and it will add up some of the quantities for you and be able to provide you a guideline. Obviously, as in anything today, we need to use our engineering judgment, right? We do not want to just input anything into you know, a database and have it spit out something and have it be the end all be all. We need to use our engineering judgment. That's why we're all engineers, and we need to utilize that and make a final decision to move forward in terms of providing an independent cost estimate that we can compare against the contractor's one when we're doing negotiations. And then also one of the things we talked about, top-down estimation. So we have this is an example of an ICE, and we have all of the costs. So the cost of additioning planting soil, that is the direct cost. We have escalation cost. We have a subtotal, and we have overhead and profit, bond, GET tax, so on and so forth. That calculates the unit price as to what we would estimate, and then based off of the changed circumstance, you have how much is impacted, and therefore you can calculate the total amount for what is needed. So that is a top-down approach, and as you can see here, there's the ICE, and that is our estimation. And get a little bit further, so cost justification will give a summary of adjustments to the ICE. So want to summarize the cost comparison. So comparing contractor proposal to the ICE. Now we're going to talk about P&L. So again, what is a P&L, right? Reminder from an even earlier series in CA 100. It is a comparison of independent cost estimate and the contractor's proposal to determine price objectives, so to determine targets. So identify areas of cost differences to discuss further and clarify, include the position on time and cost extended overhead based on a change impact analysis. So we want to go into a negotiation with a target. We don't want to go in just with nothing, because oftentimes when we do that, the negotiation is perhaps not as productive, right? So clearly explain the differences and negligible, I can't pronounce that, variances. Identify items needing further explanation for negotiations. So P&L is very important. Talked about this extensively previously. So we want to make sure that we are able to, here's an example, perfect. So we have the contractor's cost proposal, right? And we have our ICE. ICE was developed before the contractor's cost proposal was submitted. Oftentimes the contractor's cost proposal is much higher than an independent cost estimate. Oftentimes that's what happens. Not saying that it happens all the time, just saying what happens often. And we need to develop a P&L with a target. So at the very right, you know, we have target price. We want to go in with this target price so that we can have productive negotiations in terms of what's fair and reasonable and not just sticking on your number and saying that your number is always correct. You know, we want to be able to be fair and reasonable and have a target in mind. Okay, so some of what the cost justification will have, what, how, why, when, who. I'm gonna go over that in detail. So monetary value, it includes monetary value and time impact, interest and risk of any parties involved, regulatory constraints, complexity. So again, if the change order is very small, then you know that should determine, you know, we shouldn't be, I guess what I'm trying to say is we shouldn't be spending tons and tons of hours on a contract change order that is very, very small. If we have a contract change order that is worth millions of dollars, right? Obviously, we're going to spend a lot more time on that and be more detailed and you know, provide all of the things that I just listed. That's going to play into how much time it takes to develop CCOs, to develop a justification for that. What we don't want to do is we don't want to spend countless hours on a $4,000 change order, right? That's just a very small and providing a super great amount of detail in terms of that. So we want to make sure that we have balance in terms of that. Additionally, what happened, you know, after the change was determined, what's the plans revised, the specs revised. We want to make sure that we update that. Now we'll update that in Autodesk Construction Cloud. The specs are in Autodesk Construction Cloud. Plans are in Autodesk Construction Cloud. If there's a change that occurs, we want to make sure that we go to Sheets. We update the Sheets to the latest versioning of the sheet so that the contractor can see it and so that everybody can see it in that shared environment. ACC also has ACC Sheets has a very intuitive tool where we're comparing sheets. So that is very helpful when determining, when calculating your independent cost estimate as well, because we're able to compare the baseline sheet versus the bid set versus the addended sheet or the change sheet. So we're able to see some of the changes, and that can give you some recognition into what actually changed. Preparing your ICE. These are some of the checklist items. Request proposal, P&O, right? We got to develop that P&O before our negotiation. Schedule discussions. So after we develop the P&O, schedule the discussions, schedule the negotiations. Don't necessarily want a ton of time to lag in between the time where you develop your cost estimate and the time that you have the negotiations, right? We want to have that in a timely manner. So we want to check these off as soon as possible, right? We want forward pricing. We don't want the contractor to submit that force account and then, you know, have to deal with that, and we can't mitigate certain things. Okay, when did it happen, right? So obviously I just talked about timeliness. So we want to make sure that everything is timely and to the requirements. I know I don't have it on this PowerPoint. We've shown that infographic on notification multiple times. Want to make sure that the timeliness is according to the specs. And yeah, so I won't go into detail on all of this stuff. Sorry. So who was involved and where did it happen? Who submitted and prepared the contractor's proposal? Who prepared the ICE? It's the project engineer. Name and positions of the persons involved in negotiations, right? We want to make sure that the negotiations, when they happen, they're documented, right? Because a lot of times the district engineer is not going to be involved in these, not going to be at the meeting with these negotiations. We want to make sure that we have documentation of that and, you know, perhaps attach it to the justification in the change order. Explain any consequences, so why, discoveries, disclosures during negotiations, explain why any adjustments were necessary to the P&L. And just to wrap it up, you know, the justification, why it's needed, backup documentation for review. It's for authority for executing CCO, so reviewers. So like I said before, these reviewers are people who do not have who are not checking on this project on a daily basis. So we want to make sure that the time justification, the cost justification is detailed, very detailed, and has all of the things needed to provide historical and accurate information for those people who are going to have to finally and ultimately sign off on these justifications. So highlighted right there, create breadcrumb for a third party to be able to follow. So if a third party can follow it, somebody who has nothing to do with this project is able to follow it, then that's how it should look. These are just from the previous training, some examples of, top-down estimating, some examples of where you're pulling bid data from to formulate your independent cost estimate. So finally, this is the first page that I showed you, but just to wrap things up, validate pricing with ICE, summarize the cost, prove completeness and reasonableness, and explaining consequences of the findings, discoveries, disclosures. And then we have, so again, want to emphasize two parts. First is the reasonable settlement of time adjustments, so justifications. So when you're going to submit your change order for review, if applicable, if there is a time extension or reduction, needs to have this time justification. So TIA, backup information, time discussed, CPM schedules, baseline schedules, and justification of those changes between the two. All of that needs to be included in your time justification, and it needs to show on your change order time justification. And then in a separate justification, we're going to include the cost justification on your change order. So make sure that that includes your ICE, right? Your independent cost estimate, making sure that you include contractor's proposal, and then you can include the negotiated price. Want to show all of that detail because, as I said before, a lot of times these people reviewing it are not in those meetings, right? So we want to be sure that we include all that information for how we got to the price that is on the work description of work at the beginning of the change order in Headlight. So be sure that that is included. Justification shows P&O, making sure why the adjustments were made, why the agreed amount is fair and reasonable. So that is the point of a cost justification, right? Settlement may have been reached above by the ICE business decision with circumstances. So again, this sometimes happens, right? So settlement may be reached not necessarily according to the ICE, but it may be a business decision, or it may be perhaps, above our heads decision. So then we just have to be able to also explain that in sort of a narrative way as a justification as well. So we want to justifications can not only be, in most cases it's like a numbers thing, right? It's going to be numbers and negotiations and calculations, but in a lot of instances too, it is a narrative, and sometimes people get that confused with the necessity, right? But the necessities and change request form is essentially and we've talked about this previously, but explaining why the change order is necessary. But then the justification sometimes will require narratives as well, where it will have to explain and justify why the cost is that, why this cost was settled, and perhaps it will take a narrative as well to explain, why this change was justified at this, or why this price is justified. So it may take a narrative as well. Okay. So finally, to wrap things up, this is important also to above district engineer, admin. So lawyers, these documents can help win or lose the claim. So we want to make sure that this is of the utmost importance, and we're tracking change order documentation properly. So with that, it's 8:26. I know we went over a good amount today, but does anybody have any questions on this topic that we went over today, or on any of the previous topics that we've discussed before? And Joel, I want to be sure, do you have anything to add?
I'll add one thing is, I know it's kind of difficult to put together an independent estimate when you're talking time related overhead. So sometimes, yeah, I only say that because, we're not always going to have the financial information to be able to do an Eichley's formula on our side. That would kind of come from the contractor. So I think it's really just a matter of evaluating whatever they submit in that case. I mean, if you are able to do an independent estimate, then you can use that. But if that proves difficult, you can also just, you know, review what they submit, go through their backup documentation, and then if you determine it reasonable, if you determine that the pricing is reasonable, you know, you can compare it against like Hawaii revised statutes. I think it's, what is it, section 3-125.13, price adjustment for construction contracts. And, you know, there's other ways that you can kind of justify the cost, and it just has to meet a certain threshold of quote unquote reasonableness, right? So and again, it's kind of taking a look at how did they draw that cost? Did they, you know, put their entire workforce on a delay even though the project was still moving? And, you know, at what point can you kind of draw the line and say, well, maybe they were partly, you know, not fully utilized during this delay period. So I think when it comes to time-related overhead cost analysis, it gets a little bit trickier with doing, you know, an independent estimate and those types of things, just because we're not going to always have all that information and data. So, but as I said, if you are able to put something together and you know, use it to justify the overall goal is we're trying to justify the amount that we're agreeing to with the contractor, and making sure that that makes sense for, you know, for federal highways and everyone else. So as long as we can make sense of it, we have to draw it up in a way that it makes sense to those parties that aren't heavily involved in the project like we are. Just wanted to add that.
Oh, thank you, Joel. So yeah, I did have some short examples that I was going to go over, but we are out of time. I will say that, you know, after, I think we have one more technical training for this changes in claim series, one or two more. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go over overarching examples. So we're going to take claims that actually occurred, and we're going to go over all of the steps with you. Because I know we talk about this stuff and, you know, conceptually, you know, it probably makes sense. But we're going to put it to actual examples. And I know we were doing a little bit of that at the beginning with after, you know, different site conditions and notification, we gave some longer examples, but we figured at the very end is where we'll give examples after we explain everything conceptually and technically. We're going to go over we're going to go over claims, and we will analyze them with you guys. So be on the lookout for those invites. But yeah, so we're going to go over very detailed and long examples moving forward. So I know that was probably one of the questions, but yes, we will be going over overarching examples and applying everything that we've learned thus far conceptually here in the next couple of months. So is there any questions?
Hey, Cord, no questions, but really appreciate it, man. You guys covered some basics, but also they're very important components to these change orders, these claim analysis and stuff. So thanks, guys. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you. All right. Well, as always, you know, econ email is URSC. If you have any questions after the fact, please be sure to ask that. We also have the training archive here.
We did have one question, Cord, from Calvin. He was asking if we were going to cover